Chapter 2: Foundations of the Situation. To understand the status of education across the continent of Africa, it is instructive to be knowledgeable about not only the current education situation as illuminated in the previous chapter, but also the education environment and institutions preceding the current systems. Additionally, to appreciate potential transition complexities, it is helpful to understand the major components which brought the phenomenon into existence. Reviewing academic literature and organization policy documents from various entities provided the historic grounding necessary to comprehend the institutional and, in some cases, individual perspectives and goals which shaped EIE philosophies, relationships, and power dynamics. This is necessary, especially because the tendency for cyclical or path-dependent policy implementation to occur indicates the foundational issues raised here could continue to occur in the future. Using the strategy of examining knowledge conveyance philosophies and theories, the educational environment writ large is subdivided into chronological categories with education in emergencies and external education provider philosophies interspersed. This method is used to address the thesis that the current education practices, systems, and policies are based on recently historic philosophies and policies, as well as international development philosophies and policies, none of which are founded on African countries' perspectives for how to maximize human capital of their citizens as a whole. In fact, the education sector has remained anemic through both internal and external ineptitude in the best-case scenario or malfeasance in the worst-case scenario. The literature reviewed is presented in sections focused on, arguably, the major components of education in emergencies contexts in Africa. The literature looks at the complex system of interwoven and interworking academic literature on education policy foundations specific to Africa, organizational change and development as a general business practice, and on authoritarian government systems in relation to the education sector. While the logic in reviewing the literature for education policy and organizational change may be straightforward, the logic for reviewing authoritarian government systems may be less so. A focus is on authoritarian governments because authoritarian government control in post-conflict environments is common, can remain in place for long periods of time, and often has varying degrees of domination or suppression over citizens, which may not normally occur with less fragile, more pluralistic, or more democratic governments. These are also the government structures likely to be put in place when new institutions are created supporting future national-level systems. Democratic governments, it has been argued, are more likely than authoritarian governments to have accountability mechanisms via elections, transparency, media-enabled public scrutiny, and an educated citizenry. This leaves similar studies under democratic governments for future projects. Despite this focus on authoritarian governments, a complication of studying them is access to and the accuracy of information from the government or from its contracted entities. External education provider project or program mission statements are likely to have these details, but access to these documents is limited. Therefore, the literature reviewed in this area has to be limited. Based on the data found, the general goal of an EEP is to act on behalf of the government until the government can resume functionality of basic social services to include education. Preliminary research and informal inquiries indicate a gap in transitioning the provision of education between EEPs and the respective National Education Authority. Initial inquiries indicated the transition was not planned for and often does not occur. In point of fact, a review of the literature to this point, with the stated limiting caveats, has not determined any EEP to government transitions in Africa. In many cases, if a post-conflict education system exists, it very closely resembles the pre-conflict education system. Therefore, understanding the previous education system is necessary, since the similarities or derivations may serve, inadvertently or deliberately, to perpetuate past education-related problems in the country. Working premises for the literature reviewed focused on three aspects of a transition between EEPs and refugee hosting governments. First, the authoritarianism continuum extends from low-functioning democracies to electocracies, to authoritarian systems, and through to dictatorships. Second, the literature addresses private and public organization change and development to address some of the considerations for dynamics of the EEPs and their government counterparts. Third, the tendency of governments is to rebuild along lines similar to previously existing institutions. These three considerations are interconnected, making uniquely relevant the relationship between historic and current issues involving internal and external national education system inputs and controls. Bearing the above considerations in mind, readers should take as a final note that the analytical assumption upon which this field is based is that the goal of national governments, regional governing bodies, and the EEPs is to sustain cultural and governance structures of the country as a whole and to maximize human capital. While there is ample evidence against many countries that the maximization of these goals is not equally sought within each country, addressing structural inequalities internal to national education structures is beyond the scope of the present project. Therefore, this chapter is the literature foundation for the topic and its subtopics, which also provide detailed insight on points raised in the findings in the data of this original research. Further, the chapter is structured as a literature review for ease of reference to source documentation regarding subtopics. Researchers and theoreticians are invited to dive in. However, those readers who would like to get to the meat of the data findings and analysis can move to the next chapter, knowing any points raised there can be substantiated by coming back to the detailed foundations established here.